Welcome, everyone, as we continue our exploration of Rebbe Nachman. And I won't say this is our last one this time because it's not been. There's always more to take. And I'm actually really um, looking forward to what we're going to study together today. And I'll put up on the screen since I'm virtual. I can do that easily. Um, and we talked about some of the areas where Rebbe Nachman has done the most kind of theological work and inspirational work, and now is joy and depression and how to be joyful always. That was a very big focus of his. Um, and today we're going to be looking at another whole area that's called strengthening or encouragement. And he really was trying to help his people go through all the vicissitudes of life and of spiritual life specifically, and give them encouragement and help them find meaning within everything they were going through, and deeply believed and taught about it. And he brought out a side of Judaism that was always there, and we'll talk about this as we go through it. Judaism sees, from the beginning where God says to Abraham, tests Abraham 10 times to go through all these things and these difficulties, but that through them he grows and he becomes a better person, and same with Sarah and all of the characters of the Torah. They all go through their difficulties, but they grow, and that's part of how our tradition understands life. Life has purpose. You grow, you become closer to God, to the divine. And so he really talked about that process of life that we go through and the growth and how the challenges, but how to find strength. And when times are difficult, what do you do? That was a big part of. So we know about the joy part, but there's other parts too. And one of the elements that I wanted to talk about and just introduce it today is again, we're using the same compendium as we did when we explored joy, and that's Likutei Etzot, which means a collection of advice. And this was put together by his chief disciple, Nathan of Nemirov, who became Nathan of Breslov. These are two different towns, and he started off in Nemirov. And it's few details. I think it's interesting enough to hear how all of this happened and was transmitted. But that his Natan of Nemirov, his disciple, came from this very great rabbinic family, but was always searching for something more, and eventually found Rebbe Nachman, and he impressed him more than any other rabbi he'd encountered. He'd encountered the greatest rabbis, and even some of the great Hasidic rabbis, who all he impressed him. But Rebbe Nachman, there was something about him that just drew him straight to Rebbe Nachman. And he had a photographic memory, which was very useful because we might not think about it, but usually when do rabbis talk, they talk on Shabbat. And Rebbe Nachman often gave his discourses on Shabbat. And you can't, right? Traditionally, you don't take notes on Shabbat. So how do you record what the rabbi says on Shabbat for posterity? They didn't have Zoom back then. So what did they do? So Rebbe Natan, he had a photographic memory. So they say that after every Shabbat or holiday, he would go back home and he would write down everything Rebbe Nachman had said. And that's the only reason we have all of Rebbe Nachman's teachings. 90% of them were all compiled by Rebbe Natan. If it wasn't for him, we'd have nearly nothing. And he wasn't only a compiler, but he also, there was such a volume of material, even though Rebbe Nachman died so young, that what he did is he organized it. I mean, even to this day, his organization is so useful. So Likutei Etzot is organized according to theme. And so you have a theme on joy, a theme on strengthening, a theme on all kinds of different areas, which are very relatable categories even to this day, right? I mean, for all of us, if you're trying to look for a little bit of spiritual advice on any of these categories, you can go and look it up. And it's really well organized. And some of it is, I would say about usually 20 to 30% maybe is hard to relate to because it's written in a certain context and put together out of their Stiebel world of 200 years ago. But a lot of it is very relatable. So I encourage everyone to go check that out. But before, I don't know, last week we studied that story. Anybody have any any thoughts left over from that story or anything that was sitting in their minds they want to share? If not, go ahead, Charles.
Well, I was reading to the end. We didn't do it during our
That's
session,
true.
and
Yes.
I'm sitting there saying to myself, well, the clever one doesn't recognize the king, which may be supreme, universal power source or God, but
Yes.
he recognizes and he takes as valid the devil.
Yeah.
So there's why does he believe in the devil and not in the good that the other
Hmm.
face side of the coin represents what the simple one took and thought was you know real. So
Interesting. I think
I'm
I
thinking
think
to
it's
myself, he's
because you're saying
giving
in our days, when you think of people who aren't religious, you think they don't believe in a devil or a God, right? They're going to believe in nothing.
exactly.
So I would say maybe part of Rabbi Nachman was saying is that the simplicity of the simple one is he's just joyful and he's going to believe in ultimate goodness and he's not going to say there's such a he's not going to believe it or he's not going to see the evil or he's not going to focus on the evil. He sees it, right? When people are being nasty to him, he says, don't mock me, but he's going to focus on the good. And while the other man, who's really a genuine seeker in his own way of knowledge and everything, he ends up seeing so much darkness in the world because of his own thing. And so maybe it's
Maybe
part of
it's
Rebbe Nachman's don't focus on the darkness too much. Um,
mhm. Well, maybe that's what Rabbi Nachman says is being too clever is you're focusing on the evil rather than on the joy.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting point. Thank you for bringing it up. Um, all right, I'm just gonna open up. I can share my screen. So if you don't have it pulled up, no worries. And so there we go. I hope everybody can see. Um, it's called Hid Chazkut in Hebrew. It's the name of his chapter of the Rebbe Nachman put all these teachings together, um, and it's called right. It comes from the word chazak in Hebrew, which many of us know, which means strong, right? It's when it's a very common word, but in the Hebrew, right, when you have heat, right? The heat pa'el form, it's just a little bit of grammar. It makes it often reflexive. So it's how to strengthen yourself. So how do you strengthen yourself? How do you encourage yourself through difficult times, through challenging times? And he's talking in many ways specifically about challenges in our individual lives, but I think it applies to when we're individually feeling challenges in our national lives or international lives, um, when the world feels like a mess, um, which it does, at least to me. So here we are. Likutei Etzot, Rebbe Natan of Nemirov. I put up his dates. Um, they're helpful for people to get a sense of around Napoleon. My every one of my greatest discoveries over the summer was this audio book of the story of the world. It's meant for kids, but adults learn a lot too. It's about 40 hours of the whole story of the world. And it's been nice. So we're right now around this period of time with my kids, and it's all about in Europe. This is around Napoleon, right? Napoleon's taken over right in the early 1800s, and up into the middle, Napoleon is taking over much of Europe, right? This is um, a lot of what's happening, and back and forth, and the great czars of Russia. So it's nice to know that historical context. I want to welcome Jennifer. Okay, great you're with us. Okay, well, our tradition is for Alan to begin our reading. Tradition is tradition, after all. And Alan, if you don't mind getting us going with
As as long as I don't have to sing and dance to Fiddler on the Roof.
if you can sing the rain in Spain, then that's sufficient.
Okay, that was enough. All right. To return to God, one must be expert in the law, the halacha, which literally means going. A person must be skilled in traveling the necessary path so that nothing in the world will discourage him or make him feel rebuffed. Whether he makes progress or not, even if he feels himself sliding back, regardless of what he may go through, he should always be firm and follow the teaching of King David in the book of Psalms. If I ascend to heaven, you are there. And if I make hell my bed, behold, there you are. For even in the lowest pit of hell, it is possible to draw oneself closer to God, because he is to be found there too. If I make hell my bed, behold, there you are.
Uh,
Do you want me to continue?
I think I'll stop there for a second and just say that the opening phrase, I'm unsure about if he's saying to actually be expert in the halakha itself, or he just means to be expert in the other meaning of halakha, which is going. That one should always keep on going in life, right? Keep on moving. Don't just rest and dwell. If you're having a hard time, just keep on going. Just keep on going forward. And if you keep on going forward and you feel you're skilled in that journeying, if you keep in going forward, then nothing will discourage you because you'll just keep on going. And the Book of Psalms has a lot of is very connected to this whole theme in general. I mean, as we know, a lot of the Psalms are connected to King David traditionally, and King David went through many years in his life before he was King David, when he was being pursued by King Saul and had, tough years of being going from place to place and his being in physical danger. And there's a lot of Psalms that speak about going through difficult, challenging times. And so here he's harnessing the Psalms and saying that even when we feel we're in the lowest place, that God is there too, which is a very strong Hasidic ideal. The Hasidim really taught about this. Even when you're in the most terrible place and we think there is no way that there's any light here and I'm just got here by my own doing, there too is hope. Okay, let's keep on going.
The greatest revelation of God's greatness comes when those who were very far from him draw closer. His blessed name is then glorified and exalted in the worlds above and in the worlds below. What this implies is that no one should ever despair of coming closer to God, even if he feels very far from him because of his sins. It may be that he has committed great wrongs, but if so, then it is precisely through his returning to God that God's glory will be exalted and magnified.
So this is again, it's interesting because it's an element, maybe element of Judaism we don't see that often put forward in this way. But he's saying that if you stray very far and then come back to God, then and coming back to God, I think, at least the way I interpret it, is in its greater context of coming back to wholeness. That's the way I see it. Not just like I've strayed from my Jewish path. I used to do this Jewish thing, and now I don't do it anymore. And now I do it again, and that is the only path. I think in general it means to, when we're in a path of purpose and meaning in our lives, and everything is making sense to us and working, and then we stray. We go through a period of time where we feel we've strayed. We're not living according to our values and our ideals. We're not where we wish our life was, and we're like, how am I ever going to get to it? And but when we then come back to where we feel we're supposed to be and being in harmony with the universe, then that's not only for us, but that glorifies the whole universe. That brings one piece of the puzzle back into its place. Um, I find it to be a very lovely idea. I don't know if that's it resonates if anybody else.
I like your notion of being far from God as being far from your own wholeness. So the way I see this is that this divine thing that you're looking for is in fact a part of you. It's not something that you need to cross a distance to get to. It's something that you just have to, what they call turn. You have to turn around to get to it. And if you turn around and get to it, it's always with you. I mean, it's like the back of your head when you're looking out the front of your head. So that's a simple way to think about it. And yeah, and it sort of takes away the notion that there's some divinity sitting somewhere in the universe that has a real concrete distance from you, or there's some king sitting on a throne that you have to get close to. So if you can get that to disappear for yourself, you'll be better off.
Well, as you were speaking, you were saying almost exactly the words of the Torah itself, right? Moses says the word is not so far that you have to cross some sea to get it. It's not so far that you have to go up into the heavens to find it. It's in your very heart, if only you'll return to it, right? That's Moses speaking in Deuteronomy to the people about their relationship to God. So even though somehow, on one hand, we have this vision in God of God as being far off and some faraway place in the sense that God, infinity is unreachable, but there's also what Moses himself says, it's in your very heart, it's on your very lips, is the other part of that quote, right? So it's like you're saying, it's not far, though sometimes it can feel far, which is I think why one can feel far from one's own self. Like that part of one that may be only the other side of your own face, or it might be even the innermost part of your being, but one can feel very far from that place. At times, it can feel like you're a universe away from it. But really it's your own, it's your very own, it's what being made in the image of God means in a lot of the Kabbalistic teachings. Okay. Any other thoughts on this or? Okay.
Yeah, I'll just kind of chime in that
Yeah.
that this is what I've found. I mean, I didn't think this when I was younger, it was over time, but that's what I've kind of found at the moments when I feel most unworthy or most distant from God. That, I mean, you have a tendency to think, I'm not going to do this because I'm unworthy or whatever. And I found that it's at those moments that I most need to pray and, reach out to God and make that connection. And and this is like absolutely right on to what I've kind of discovered on my life. I'm really enjoying these teachings, by the way, Rabbi. These are really fantastic. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like there's what I enjoy about them is that I feel there's space to breathe in them and there's freedom in them, which is nice. And they speak to experience and they're, no matter, keep on going, right? And so I really enjoyed that too. But thank you for sharing that. I think there's, in a sense, when one feels far from that place, then don't despair. There's a way back. And for the Baal Shem Tov, right? I've shared this teaching before, but so in the second paragraph of the Shema, right? This is one of the most difficult prayers for us to recite, and it's one of the ones we recite twice a day. It used to be that in our synagogue, we gave it to the president to say it because if somebody's going to say it, might as well have the president say it so we don't have to focus on it. But it was a prayer that said, well, if you do everything well, God will bring the rain. And if you don't, God is not going to bring the rain. God's going to punish you and make the land uninhabitable and all this stuff. And so what do you do with such a theology? So what the Baal Shem Tov says is that, well, if you serve God and do what you're supposed to, then you'll feel in harmony with all of creation. And whether the rains come or not, they'll come at the right time. Because even if they don't come, you're in harmony with the world, so you'll find a way around it. But he says when you're not in harmony with God or with yourself, and even if the rains do come, they'll feel like they're not coming at the right time. And everything will always feel disjointed and not in its proper place. And so he says it's all if we're in harmony with God and with ourselves and the universe, then we can get through anything. Then everything happens and everything is connected. And we're in harmony with the whole universe. And when we're out of kilter, then no matter how hard we try, nothing's going to work for us. So I find that to be a very beautiful interpretation of that ancient passage. Okay, so let's go, Alan. Let's do one more. And just to preface this one, this is bringing in a whole other element, and I wanted to bring in a little bit because it's one I haven't concentrated on so far with Rebbe Nachman, even though it's one of his pillars, because it's less relatable to people probably in our community, which is the notion of the tzaddik, right? The tzaddik is the Rebbe or the head of the community usually. A tzaddik just means a righteous person, but in Hasidic theology, the righteous person is the spiritual master, is truly the guide between heaven and earth. And there's this very strong belief in Hasidism, as there are in many world mystical traditions, that there are men and women, and there are women also in the Hasidic tradition, not as many. These are patriarchal systems that it came out of, but that there are men and women who achieve something spiritually to an extent that then they are able to guide others, and they are guided by God, just like the prophets of the Bible, to an extent that they're able to, though most of them would say they hadn't reached quite the level of the prophets of the Bible, but they would say that they were able to guide others and to bring blessing into the world. And that's just part of Hasidic theology, even if in our world, in our communities, we don't encounter that so much. But maybe a way of relating to it in a way that's in popular culture is the Dalai Lama, or the Rebbe. These are people who in our lifetimes are considered to be modern saints, so to speak. Okay, Alan, if you don't mind reading number 3, which mixes a number of things together. Go ahead.
It is a good thing for friends who are attached to the tzaddikim to give encouragement to each other. The main source of strength they have to draw on is the tzaddik himself. His power is so great that he can draw up even the most damaged soul, even a soul that has not yet begun to emerge from the profane to the holy by a single hair's breadth. The thought that the tzaddik can renew such a soul should give everyone a feeling of encouragement. However low a person's level may be, and no matter what he may have been through, there is a genuine hope for him so long as he attaches himself to the tzaddik. A person should remind his friend about this in order to give him encouragement. He should also find other ways of encouraging him and strengthening his devotion to God. It is a good thing to pass on to his friends as much of the teachings of his teacher as he himself can understand.
So part of this I wanted to focus on was the aspect of the friends. And so he's writing this to his students who are Hasidim. But I think we could transpose this a little bit to members of a synagogue, for example, and just talk about, he's talking the importance about strengthening each other, right, and helping each other when we go through the difficulties of life, which just like in a Hasidic community, any religious community is the same, right? You see people as they go through loss, you see people as they go through, all kinds of things in their lives, and right, what's one of the biggest sources of help when one's going through difficulty is the friendship of others and the encouragement of others, and that's a tremendous value. And so I think that in our, I don't know, anybody else have any other thoughts about this teaching, including the tzaddik part if they want?
I'm having a little bit of a problem with the role given to the tzaddik.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it just seems like it's very, very close to what I would think they would have wanted to say, to look to God. But here they're saying, look to the tzaddik.
Yeah. Well, it's true. They do in Hasidic theology. They really look to the tzaddik as God is invisible and hard to reach, but in the tzaddik you have access to it. And I'll say that um, one this is not that different than in the Torah Moses, right? People went to Moses for everything, right? And Moses sometimes said go to God, and sometimes Moses was the source of their blessing and other characters like Moses throughout the Tanakh, right? The prophets who did miracles and who helped people, and even you read through the Talmud, and the same with the early rabbis. It was same kind of thing. The people they would turn to, and there were the prophetesses as well, and so there is within Judaism too, as our modern sensibility is graded by it, and it's interesting, but there's that parsha in the Torah, right? Korach. So I don't know if you remember this. Korach has a rebellion against Moses, and he challenges Moses in the desert. And what happens? What does he say to Moses? Aren't we all holy, right? Kulam sadikim, we're all holy. Kulam kedoshim. And says, why do you, Moses, raise yourself above us? And so Moses falls on his face, right, and says, well, let's see. And so then they each give an offering to God. And what happens? The earth opens up and eats up Korach and all of his followers, right? And so in our days, there's a lot of kind of comments about this episode in the Torah, and it says, well, what you want to make of it? And there's a lot of modern people say, well, isn't Korach right? We are all holy. Why did Moses make himself? And so, I mean, the traditional answer, and then there's been the counter against that whole stream of thought is, well, there are people like Moses who spent many years, who did receive a calling from God, so to speak, and everybody's made in the image of God. But when Korach was saying we're all holy, he wasn't saying, all of us are holy. He was saying, I want some of your power, Moses. That's what he was really saying. And so that's what God was responding to. And so it's a challenging, it's a big argument in our days. Is everybody holy? Yes, we are all made in the image of God, but there are those who've gone through that journey more and who've really, developed an expertise in it, and to use a different language. And those are tzaddikim and of all kinds. So a little bit of food. Go ahead.
Yes, in this day and age, maybe we are worried about how do we know somebody is a tzaddik and not just like a cult leader. We have all
Sure.
those issues. And how do you know?
Well, is the Dalai Lama tzaddik? Or
Well, his followers think that he is, I'm sure.
yeah.
I mean,
Well, you never really know. I mean, you never really know. But it depends how you feel when you're in the company of people like that. The other tradition I am familiar with is the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is in the Eastern tradition, a guy who goes to nirvana and then comes back from nirvana to drop something among the humans. So
Yeah.
he comes back and he's sort of glowing. Okay, he's sort of glowing, and people want to come and they want to be close to him because they feel something coming from him. That's about
Exactly.
you follow your nose in these things.
Yeah. And
for
so
better, I guess.
and it's true, there are, especially there are cult leaders, and I mean I would say from my understandings and experiences, you're in the presence of someone who's a tzaddik if you feel freedom and peace. And my sense of what it's like to be, I've never been, I don't think, maybe a few times people I think maybe were cult leaders, but cult leaders, they give you a sense of security because they're telling you how to think and how to dress and how to be. but they don't give you a sense of freedom. They give you a sense of, and you don't feel, you feel secure, but I don't think you feel a sense of spiritual peace, of feeling like yourself. They're telling you how to feel, but there's a fine line there. I think there is a fine line there. But I think you have to go, but there's that traditional teaching about within the Hasidic movement, where someone, right, went to one of the Hasidic masters and said, I didn't go to that Hasidic master to see, how they prayed. I went to see how they tied their shoes, which is before you accept anybody as your Rebbe or Rebbetzin or whatever, you check really carefully. You go and see how they tie their shoes. You make sure that every part of their life is in alignment. And a lot of these cult leaders, if you dig a little deeper and you see their relationship with, with their relationships with people of the opposite sex in their cult, or their relationship with money, how they tie their shoes, it might want you to go the opposite way, right? So, check before you accept somebody as your Rebbe or as your teacher of any religion. I think you want to go see how they tie their shoes. There's another story of the student of a Chassid who went and hid under his Rebbe's bed, because he wanted to, like, okay, well, I want to, when you're in the moment where nobody else is around you, I want to hear, what you're really saying and acting, because it's easy, right? It's easy to act a certain way when you're in public, but and I think one has to develop spiritual discrimination, which is when you're with someone, do you feel like you trust them? And I think that sense of trust, not everybody has that, but there've been endless articles about it and teachings about it. And in the Hasidic world, the notion of the tzaddik, which was developed in the early generations, this is at least the thinking, became a little bit, maybe fully or in some ways not fully, corrupted when it became hereditary, because you'd think a tzaddik is not something you can always pass down from parent to child, but it's something that has to be earned and not always can be passed down. But it's complicated.
May I say
Sure.
in spite of what David said, which was interesting, I'm with taking Alan's point and pushing it further. Just for me personally, I have no attraction to, in fact, I have an aversion, I guess, to the idea of binding oneself to the tzaddik. If I were a Christian, I would have an intermediary better than the tzaddik. I'm not, and I don't, and yet I see that among the Hasidim, sometimes they lose their tzaddik. I mean, and they don't necessarily disappear. So I think with the Bratslaver Hasidim, correct me if I'm wrong, they haven't had a tzaddik for generations, and yet they go to the Rebbe's gravesite and so on, and they manage to keep themselves along. And with the Lubavitcher Chabad, they split in certain ways, but they no longer have a Rebbe, and they don't see having one again, although they take different views on the current situation. But it's very striking that they go on taking over the world of Jewry without having that tzaddik, and they just have a lot of things he wrote and stories about him, and frankly, a lot of legendary material built in too about how he always gave the best business advice and everything else. I think the story of tying the shoes is wonderful, and it has a Zen flavor to it. Although you were taken in a different direction, but it's I fear the charismatic man, and I don't warm to that. I have a hard enough time just understanding and trying to understand these relationships, and you're trying to have an open mind toward it, because I tend not to feel that way. But the tzaddik itself is a real problem for me, and I take it for some of the Hasidim as well. I went on too long. I'm sorry.
Well, I like what you brought up about the fact that on some level that one can find, even if one doesn't have a Rebbe, that within the teachings and stories, of a figure, which frankly is what we do with our patriarchs and matriarchs too, right? I mean, we read their stories every year, and they're kind of like our Rebbes and Rebbitzins, or wherever you want to see it. We learn from the example of their lives, and we invoke them in blessing and prayer. It's not right. So we look to them as the guides of Judaism, or the patriarchs and matriarchs of Judaism. So there's when even if they're not around, by reading the example of their lives, it gives us inspiration, and it's to imagine if the Torah had no stories but was only teachings, right? That would feel very dry. It would be very hard to connect to. But the fact that we do have stories of figures gives us human beings, we have a need for stories, and for something more personal to connect to. And so I think that it fills that need. And I think my personal view is the higher caliber that figure is morally and ethically and spiritually, then the easier it is to connect to that person. And when you have someone who's flawed, then it creates a flawed following as well. But when you have someone who really is living up to that ideal morally and ethically as well as spiritually, and has spiritual power in the sense that their words carry and inspire and last, when you have that, then it does truly bring thousands, millions, billion, people into a better life. And so there's something really powerful about that. And so in Judaism, we don't have we don't have intermediaries, and yet look, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, right? And so we still have these examples, and traditional Judaism. Go ahead. Yeah.
I would also like to make a comment. Great conversation. To me, if I were to look for somebody to follow, the Tanakh is full of comments about humility and compassion. And to me, it seems to me, if someone's going to be a leader that you want to follow, those are two qualities that you really need to look
Beautiful.
for in someone. Because there are a plethora of people out there, and I don't know, and I can speak specifically from the Christian world, who do not have those qualities and raise themselves up to be, leaders. And unfortunately, people follow them as well, but I don't see them as spiritual leaders because they don't possess those qualities of humility and compassion. And I think those are things that the Dalai Lama has, and other leaders that are recognized as worldwide holy people. Those are qualities that people have. And not that somebody's perfect, because I see the spiritual life as a continual growth pattern, even with really holy people. But that should be the general drift of their lives. That's what I think anyway.
Thank you for sharing. And I love that humility and compassion. And the Talmud has endless exploration of humility, and extolling humility, and talking about how our religious leaders or Jewish leaders should have that humility in leading. And it's an interesting, based on what everybody's saying, because in our modern Jewish context, we have a kind of funny relationship with spiritual leadership in some ways, which is a lot of even Jewish spiritual leaders don't really want to lead in that same way, or they want to lead from books, from what others have said, because it's more comfortable to lead from books. And I mean, in some ways that's a place of humility, though. Then the ego comes from a place of how much knowledge they have, and all of that. But I mean, before I became a rabbi, I was a journalist, and the last article that I wrote as a journalist was after attending a conference of world religious leaders that did this number of surveys leading up to it. And one of the surveys found that Jews had the least confidence in their leaders of any religious group in the world, which I found to be really upsetting. And as part of this conference, I was observing our leaders and other leaders of other religions, and it's always easy to see what's lacking in one's own religion more than in others. So, but I thought, there's, people do seek it. People seek leadership, but it has to come with that wholeness, with that ethical, moral wholeness. And so, anyway, a little bit of food for thought. Let's.
Can I bring in one other aspect of this
Sure, go
portion?
ahead. Yeah.
I think that we need to pay attention also to the friends who have been all a group
Thank
with
you.
empathetic. I mean, you can look at it in a more, secular way and talk about a mentor. And if there's many people studying with a mentor, whether it's a, doctoral program or something else, and you all go in different ways, you've all been inspired in the same way. And there's a lasting connection to that. And you know each other from having been inspired and thinking in certain ways and growing in certain ways. And I think that part about the friends reminding people of that and staying as friends and encouraging means that you know that best part of each other because you've gone through that together. And I think even if it's not a tzaddik that you're committed to a lifetime with, you still have those kinds of mentors that do bring together those kinds of friendships that know each other that way.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I love that. I think people experience, there's, college professors that take on that almost a similar role, right? With groups of students and exposing them to a world of thought and of, consciousness, really a state of mind, exploration. That's quite similar, really. And the students, it's interesting, right? How students of certain mentors and thought leaders then have, try to keep alive that tradition, and then and how to support, because I guess there's a special link that's creating from from sharing that figure or that teaching in some ways that then allows, one becomes brothers and sisters, and of a certain kind, intellectually and spiritually. And then who are the people who are best there to help support us, as those people with whom we share that worldview and friendship, right? The Maimonides' levels of friendship, the highest level of friendship is those people we share a spiritual inclination with and walk in the world. That's the highest level of friendship that there is. Thank you so much.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I want to mention Rabbi Lowe. I was in Prague, I think, like 2017, and I went to visit his grave and was enchanted with the story of the golem that he created. And it seems that, rather than going to living tzaddiks, it seems that there's a lot of interest in also going to the graves of people who were tzaddiks and are no longer alive.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a belief, especially among Hasidim but among all religions, that somehow there is a connection that's made, and one gets spiritual nourishment from it. And that part of it is the yearning of people going to that place, right? A whole bunch of people going to a place, the same place creates an atmosphere and a yearning and a divine response. But in some ways, that's the creation of any holy space, right? What makes the space holy? I mean, we talked about this last week, but that there's groups of people there who are building up the ladder, right? Why is the Temple Mount holy, not Mount Sinai? Mount Sinai, God came down to visit the people, but at the Temple Mount, people built up a ladder to God, right? Through their prayers and worship. And so those places where people build up prayer, and maybe the grave of people whom they really look up to as one such place, creates a focal point for blessing to come into the world. Let's do one more teaching. It's taking it to a little bit of a different place. So if anybody else wants to continue on this line, we could continue talking about tzaddikim and this because we're.
I have a
Go ahead.
something, and when I was listening to you and Phil earlier,
Yeah.
it struck me that when we talk about our forefathers in the Tanakh, they're full of faults.
Mhm.
And we learn from them, not just because of the good things that they did, but because of their faults.
Mhm.
And yet, we now have this group of tzaddikim that, from what I can see, we have raised to a whole other level because they don't have any faults. And I'm sort of grappling with how did we make that transition, that the people that, I don't know, deserve to be revered are full of faults, and these later people are not.
Well, I would say that there wouldn't be a single one of these Hasidic leaders who would ever say that they were on a higher level than any of the patriarchs and matriarchs themselves. And so part of what you're talking about is our modern perception of the patriarchs and matriarchs, because the traditional through millennia vision of the patriarchs and matriarchs is they went through their journeys, but once they went through their journeys, I don't know if they were perfection, but right, God says to Abraham, be perfect, be blameless, and they made him Abraham from Abraham. So we do read of their faults, but they're still considered to be, spiritual giants. And none of the Hasidic masters who were Rebbes would dare say that they were even, close to the level of any of our patriarchs and matriarchs. So I think part of that is just a matter of perception. And even to this day, nobody's saying the Amidah and saying, "Blessed are you, God, God of Schneerson, God of the Baal Shem Tov, God of Rebbe Nachman." Nobody would dare say that. So I think what you're saying is true, that we do go through their faults, and the Hasidic Rebbes, frankly, have not. Their stories have been published in different ways. They're secondary figures, and the patriarchs and matriarchs, their lives are open books to us, right? We know their faults and their strengths, and we emulate them, but they're considered by the tradition to be in a much greater level than the Hasidic masters, so to speak. So the later prophets of the Tanakh. Also, you see their stories of being called. You don't have so much exploration of it. But I think actually part of what Rebbe Nachman is talking about here, and here I'll take us to the very end of all of it. If you go to page 32, here, I want to give us a taste of what's at the end, and then so that we can look at it more next time. Will someone reach for us 24, 32, 33, and 34?
I'll read.
Thank you, Laurel.
What are we starting with? 24?
24, yeah.
Main source of strength is the heart. A person whose heart is steadfast will never be afraid of anyone or anything. He can achieve remarkable feats and win fierce battles simply through the strength of a heart which fears nothing and does not run from the battle lines. This applies literally to serving God. Understand this well. All the climbing and falling and turbulence are a necessary preliminary to entering the gates of holiness. All the tzaddikim have endured all this.
So
if you are sorry.
Let's just stop for a second. So that's what you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
This is the patriarchs and matriarchs. So they're saying this is Rebbe Nachman, and all of them say this. All the tzaddikim go through climbing and falling and turbulence. In some ways, it's the essential message of the book of Genesis about trying to reach God, right? Climbing, falling, turbulence. That's the lives of all the patriarchs and matriarchs who we read and Moses too, right? And all of them have the this climbing and falling and turbulence. So we may not be tzaddikim, but we try and do it in our own way in our lives, or we try and through all of our climbing and falling and turbulence, and for our own ways to however way we see it, enter the gates of holiness, however we understand that. We all understand that differently, values or spiritual or however it is, we go through it, and he's trying to give us some help. And part of that help is that teaching that we just read 24 of, going with the heart. But we'll talk about that part more next time. If you don't mind me reading the last two ones, Laurel.
If you are so far from God that you feel that your every movement is a blemish in his eyes, understand that if a person has reached such a pitch of crass materialism, then every single gesture which he makes in the effort to extricate himself, even the merest notion he makes to move a fraction closer to God, is great and precious in God's eyes, and causes a movement of thousands upon thousands of miles in the highest worlds. In this world, man has to pass over a very narrow bridge. The main thing is not to be afraid at all.
Mm-hmm. So that statement that we began the whole Rebbe Nachman series on, Rebbe Natan puts at the end of this section on strengthening. But part of what he's saying is that this movement of moving, of getting out of the difficulties and of moving out of it, and that part is part of something much greater. It's part of a cosmic unfolding and helps move the whole universe towards goodness. And this is to link our whole conversation together for me. What links together all the different parts of our tradition, right? And this is the patriarchs and matriarchs. Why does the Torah reveal all their faults and all their struggles and tribulations to teach us that we all have to go through it? It's part of all of our lives, but also it's bringing cosmic meaning to going through that. That when you're going through those difficulties, it's not just some small thing in your own life. And their lives to us seem so grand because we read of it and we feel they started a religion and these stories are the stories of our people. But Abraham was a guy who was living in some place in a much greater world of much more important people in his world. But partly we read it because these things that happen are part of something much, much greater, and should be seen with that. And that's, I guess next time we'll go back to some of these other teachings of, well, how do we confront and go through these parts of our lives? But I find Rebbe Nachman's teachings are inspiring and powerful. Is this part? He's linking all together a whole tradition, the patriarchs and matriarchs and Moses and everything the Jewish people go through, and say, we've got to keep on going and find our heart through all of it. And believe the only way to go through it, because we don't have the absolute answers, nobody does, is believe that we're transforming the world one little bit at a time, every time we're trying to move forward within all of it. And that's, in my mind, what it means to believe in a world of purpose and meaning and not a world of chaos. Is that every little bit, as difficult as it is, and even if you can't see it, you believe is taking the world forward and transforming it in your own life and in the life in the greater unfolding. That's the source of one of the sources of spiritual hope and faith that we can bring with us. So thank you, everyone. It took a slightly different direction, I thought, but I thought it was great. I'm glad we spoke about the tzaddik, and there'll be more opportunities in the weeks ahead, even when we explore other Hasidim as well, Hasidic Rebbe's.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Very
you.
good.
Thank you, Rabbi. Feel better.
Hope
Thank
you
you.
feel better,
better.
Rabbi.
Feel better.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.